The year was 1868, and Arkansas was still struggling to recover from the deep scars left by the Civil War. Throughout its pine-covered hills and swampy stretches, quiet murmurs spread, stories of betrayal, bloodshed, and families broken apart not just by politics, but by far more personal and sinister disputes. Yet no tale stirred as much unease as that of the Whitlock family, a name that seemed to carry with it a lingering stench of fear. The Whitlocks were not leaders or men of power. They held no political influence, commanded no armies, and sought no public stature. They were simply landowners, ordinary folk, but firmly rooted in the wilderness they called home. Still, in nearby towns, people would lower their voices when speaking their name, as if saying it too loudly might bring misfortune. It wasn't simple quarrels or rivalries that haunted the Whitlocks, but something colder, older. A history not shaped by luck or fortune, but by darkness and tragedy. Their homestead stood on the outer edge of Drew County, far removed from the trade routes and rough dirt roads that connected scattered settlements. The land appeared ordinary enough. Fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, cicadas humming through the summer air, and a tall, stern house standing under a harsh southern sun. But travelers often swore that something about the Whitlock property felt wrong. Passing by meant walking faster, avoiding eye contact with the windows, and praying to leave the grounds before the dust swallowed the tree line. Outsiders might have dismissed these as country rumors, but locals knew better. There were events that defied sense, disputes that ended in death, fires that sparked without cause, and a string of tragedies that followed the family like a curse. It was in these uneasy years of post-war America that the Whitlock story began, not with a single bloody act, but with the slow decay of a family bound by anger, silence, and secrets too heavy to bear. Horror does not come overnight, it festers slowly, growing in the corners no one dares to look. For the Whitlocks, that horror ran in their blood, a legacy few understood, yet all feared. At the head of the family was Silas Whitlock, a man shaped by both war and the unyielding land. His hands were rough and calloused, his eyes cold and hollow. Silas believed only in survival, a Confederate veteran who returned home penniless. He rebuilt nothing. Instead, he tightened control over his household. To his wife, Martha, and their children, he was a man of commands, expecting silence, obedience, and unwavering loyalty. Martha Whitlock had once been different. The daughter of a preacher, she had grown up among hymn-filled chapels and close-knit communities. But under Silas's rule, her light dimmed. By 1868, she was but a shadow of her former self. Quiet, watchful, whispering prayers into the dark when she thought no one was listening. The Whitlock children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, their names half lost to time and courthouse records, grew up in a house where fear spoke louder than love. Discipline was harsh, tenderness rare, and yet an unspoken truth bound them. They were not like other families. Even as children, they seemed marked by something unseen, as though born into a fate sealed long before their first breaths. Neighbors often told of heated quarrels along the Whitlock fence line. Silas was infamous for his feuds, battling over stolen livestock, land boundaries, or grudges that went too deep to recall. But these fights went beyond the usual farmer disputes. Blood had been spilled more than once, and though lawmen were called, no real justice ever followed. What truly frightened people wasn't Silas's temper, but the pattern of misfortune that clung to the family. Livestock died without cause. Children vanished into the swamps for days, returning silent and pale. Strong barns suddenly collapsed. Infants withered before drawing a full breath. No one could explain it, but all felt it. The Whitlocks were touched by something unnatural. Arkansas in those days was a land of faith, where preachers' voices carried across the fields and scripture was the only comfort against hunger and despair. Yet even the ministers hesitated when it came to the Whitlocks. No sermon could cleanse them, no prayer could ease their pain, and so whispers began that the curse lay not upon the land, but within their blood. By 1868, the rumors had hardened. The Whitlocks were no longer spoken of as merely unlucky, but dangerous. Locals could name at least 4 violent deaths tied to them, and one, occurring during that sweltering summer, would mark the beginning of the family's final descent. One July evening, as cicadas droned through the heavy dusk, a neighbor named Elias Tully, a known drunk and troublemaker, walked onto the Whitlock property. He never returned. What happened that night lives on only in fragments, conflicting testimonies and fading recollections. Some claimed Silas shot him during an argument over stolen hogs. Others swore Martha struck the fatal blow after enduring too many insults. Still others whispered that every Whitlock hand was stained in his blood. 3 days later, Elias's body was found rotting in the edge of a swamp. The Whitlocks were the last to see him alive. Yet when the case reached court, the evidence vanished, witnesses withdrew, and the verdict fell clean: no guilt. But the town found no relief in that verdict. It only confirmed their fear the Whitlocks weren't just cursed, they were untouchable. That summer marked the true turning point. Each year after, the whispers grew darker, transforming into legend. To speak the Whitlock name became an omen. To cross their land a risk, and what followed in the years ahead would not just confirm the tales, it would brand the Whitlocks as one of the most sinister families ever to cast a shadow over Arkansas. What began with blood spilled on a fence line would soon spiral into a horror that crept within their own walls. After the death of Elias Tully, the Whitlock farm became more than a piece of land. It became a line people refused to cross, a place where the days felt shorter and the nights far too long. Began to change their routes entirely. Mothers warned their children never to wander near the Whitlock property, to keep their distance from the fence that marked where safety ended. Yet what unsettled the townsfolk most wasn't the danger itself. It was the silence that followed. The Whitlocks spoke little, carrying on as if nothing had happened. In the weeks after Elias Tully's burial, neighbors noticed a strange calm around the farm. The shouting from Silas ceased. The quarrels over land stopped. It was as though the house had swallowed its own noise, sinking into an eerie quiet. But inside those walls, the silence was only a disguise. Martha Whitlock moved softly through the halls, her prayers whispered not with faith, but with desperation. She feared what her children were becoming. Reflections of their father, hardened and hollow. The eldest son, Thomas, had already begun to mirror Silas's cold stare. At just 16, he carried himself with a defiance well beyond his years. Elias's death had marked him deeply. He didn't wear it as shame, but as a lesson. Proof that in the Whitlock household, survival meant showing no mercy and revealing no weakness. James, the second son, barely 14, reacted differently. His questions went unanswered, his curiosity buried beneath fear. He spent his time scribbling in tattered notebooks. Drawings of the swamp, sketches of lifeless animals, angry notes scrawled across yellowed pages. The memory of Elias haunted him not as pride, but as a mystery he was forbidden to speak of. The daughters, Mary and Ruth, should have been spared the weight of their father's cruelty. Girls in 1868 Arkansas were expected to tend to the home, to sew, to cook, to nurture, but tenderness couldn't survive within the Whitlock walls. Mary, the older of the two, grew sharp-tongued and silent, her eyes hard and knowing. Ruth, the youngest, barely 10, seemed far older than her years, as if grief had been her first lesson in life. Rumors in Drew County only grew darker with each passing month. Some claimed the Whitlocks held strange midnight rituals, though no preacher ever dared to confront them. Others whispered that Silas had made a pact long ago, some unholy bargain forged during the war, trading his family's souls for survival. There was no proof, but proof didn't matter anymore, fear was enough. Behind closed doors, however, the truth was far less supernatural and far more brutal. Silas used Elias Tully's death as an example. A warning to his children that power was all that mattered. A man protects what's his. He would thunder, and no one takes from us without paying. Those words etched themselves into his children's minds more deeply than any sermon ever could. Martha, once gentle and full of quiet faith, slowly faded under the strain. The deaths, the whispers, the constant dread, they hollowed her out until she barely spoke at all. Neighbors who once remembered her as kind and soft, spoken now, said she moved like a ghost. After 1868, she avoided the market, spoke only in nods, and rarely met anyone's eyes. Some claimed they saw bruises beneath her sleeves, but no one dared to ask. The land itself began to reflect the rot within the family. While other farms around Drew County rebuilt and healed from the war, the Whitlock property seemed to decay. Fences splintered, wagons rusted, the soil looked barren, and the livestock grew thin. Still, the Whitlocks endured, and their persistence terrified people even more than their ruin would have. The true horror for the town wasn't what the Whitlocks did, it was what radiated from them. Those few who ever stepped inside their home described a suffocating heaviness, as though the air itself resisted breath. A faint scent of smoke lingered even when no fire burned. Voices seemed to echo unnaturally, refusing to fade. Travelers swore they saw figures in the upstairs windows at night, still and silent, framed by the flicker of candlelight. Then came the sickness. That autumn, fever swept through Drew County, taking lives without discrimination. Families were torn apart as the illness spread. Yet inside the Whitlock house, the fever burned fiercer than anywhere else. 2 of the children nearly died. Neighbors offered food, medicine, prayers. Silas refused them all. His distrust of the outside world grew, building a fence not just of wood, but of paranoia and pride. When the fever finally broke, the family was alive but frail. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. While so many others perished, the Whitlocks survived. Every one of them. Whispers ignited once more. How could a family so cursed remain untouched by death? The only word people could find was unnatural. By winter's arrival, Drew County had changed. Invisible lines were drawn across the land. Roads people no longer traveled after dark, names they dared not speak aloud. The Whitlocks stood at the center of it all. Yet beneath the talk of curses and bargains lay a truth far simpler and far darker. Theirs was not a house haunted by spirits, but by human cruelty. Silas's rule had turned fear into a way of life and silence into a weapon. The curse of the Whitlocks was man-made, born in their own home and carried in every scar it left behind. But for those outside unable to see the truth, mystery was easier to believe. And when in the early months of 1869, another neighbor vanished near the edge of the Whitlock land, the pattern began again. The Whitlock story was no longer just about one bloody night. It had become a lineage of dread, a tale of darkness passed down like inheritance. Each disappearance, each whisper, each uneasy silence wove the family deeper into legend. By the time that winter settled, a winter of freezing rain and impassable roads, the Whitlock homestead stood shrouded in mist, untouched by light. And it was during that bleak season that their name, already cursed in the eyes of Drew County, would be bound forever to the disappearance of yet another man whose fate would deepen their infamy beyond return. Forever remained tied to the Whitlock name. The man was Samuel Carter, a humble woodcutter from a neighboring farm, known for his quiet, steady nature. Carter was a man without enemies, without debts, and with no reason to seek trouble, least of all with the Whitlocks. Yet one evening, he was seen walking toward their homestead, axe in hand and a bundle of kindling over his shoulder. He never came back. The accounts of that night differ. Some claimed he had gone to sell firewood to Silas Whitlock. Others believed he followed wagon tracks that led toward the property, unaware of where they would end. The truth, however, was lost to time. What was certain was this: 3 days after his disappearance, his blood-stained axe head was discovered lodged in the tangled roots of an old cypress tree at the swamp's edge, land that bordered the Whitlock farm. His body was never found. The uproar in town was instant. Unlike Elias Tully, whose temper often courted danger, Samuel Carter had been gentle and well-liked. His absence tore a deeper wound in the community than his modest life could have suggested. Whispers turned to accusations the Whitlocks had killed again. Sheriff Harlan Briggs rode out to investigate. A weary man hardened by the war and its aftermath, Briggs wanted no part in feuds or superstition, but duty demanded that he face the Whitlocks. When Silas opened the door, the sheriff met eyes that revealed nothing, no guilt, no anger, just an unsettling emptiness. Inside, Martha sat rigid at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly. The children lingered in the shadows, watching in silence, their expressions strangely blank, as though rehearsed. Briggs questioned them all. Each answer was short, flat, lifeless. No one had seen Samuel Carter. No one could explain the axe. Silas allowed the sheriff to search the property, but his protests were thin and measured. Still, Briggs found nothing. No signs of blood, no body, not even a trace of struggle. Frustrated and empty-handed, he returned to town, but the townspeople did not forget. In fact, it was that absence, the gap between rumor and proof, that deepened the legend of the Whitlocks. Families began saying aloud what they had once only whispered: anyone who crossed into Whitlock land risked disappearing into the swamp, swallowed by secrets no law could touch. Inside the Whitlock home, the silence thickened. Samuel Carter's disappearance had carved something irreversible into Martha. She knew in her bones what had happened, though no one ever spoke of it. The boys would not meet her eyes. Mary, the eldest daughter, flinched at the sound of her father's boots, though she never dared to speak against him. Ruth, the youngest, stopped crying altogether, not from comfort, but from understanding that tears had no use in that house. Silas, meanwhile, thrived under the tension. To him, the fear of others was strength. He told his sons that to be hated was to be respected, that a man's worth was measured in the silence of those who feared him. Samuel Carter's disappearance was no tragedy in Silas's eyes. It was a lesson, proof that the Whitlocks were untouchable. His words, repeated and obeyed, became law within the house. The town, in turn, grew more distant. Ministers warned their congregations not to deal with the Whitlocks. Neighbors stopped visiting altogether. A few families even packed their wagons and moved west, unwilling to raise their children under the shadow of that cursed land. By 1870, the Whitlocks' isolation was complete. But isolation did not bring peace. It brought madness. The children began to mirror their father's paranoia. Thomas, the eldest, no longer a boy but not yet a man, took to patrolling the property with a rifle slung across his shoulder, convinced he was protecting the family from outsiders. James, quieter and more thoughtful, withdrew further into his drawings. His notebooks filled with sketches of twisted trees, collapsing barns, and faceless figures standing in the swamp fog. When Martha glimpsed the pages, her heart broke. These were not the drawings of a child, but of someone already consumed by darkness. Mary grew sharper, colder, her silence cutting like glass. Ruth, once innocent, became eerily still, her young face frozen into a look of constant vigilance. She had learned early that survival meant never showing fear. Then, one spring night, farmers passing along a back road claimed they heard screams echoing through the cypress groves near Whitlock land. They followed the sound cautiously, but when they reached the source there was nothing, only disturbed soil and the whisper of wind through the trees. No one was reported missing, yet the story spread quickly, fueling the county's terror. By then, the people of Drew County no longer questioned whether the Whitlocks were guilty. They asked only how many more would vanish before something was done. But stopping the Whitlocks was easier said than done. They were protected not by law or wealth, but by the paralysis of fear. No one dared cross them, and thus their legend grew stronger. Two names, Elias Tully and Samuel Carter, had become warnings carved into the county's collective memory. Around them grew countless lesser stories, livestock vanishing, travelers glimpsing shapes in the dark, screams that broke the stillness of the night. The Whitlocks were no longer viewed as a family, but as a haunting, a tale whispered at firesides, a reminder to avoid the wild edges of Arkansas's land. Yet behind the walls of their decaying house, the truth was far from supernatural. What lived within was not a curse, but the slow inheritance of cruelty. The Whitlocks' darkness was not born of spells or spirits, but of silence passed from father to son, of fear turned into survival, until it became all they knew. By the early 1870s, the Whitlocks were no longer seen as mere neighbors. They had become the shadow of Drew County itself, a presence people could neither fight nor forget. The farm stood wary, its fences leaning and crops thin, but the family endured. It was not hardship that destroyed those who came near. It was the Whitlocks who consumed them. The mystery of Samuel Carter's fate would remain unsolved, but his name sealed their reputation in blood. Parents warned their children with a single command: don't go near the Whitlocks. Farmers claimed to see faint fires flickering across their land at night, glowing and then vanishing before dawn, and wherever people gathered, at church, in markets, at supper tables, the same words were whispered again and again: they are cursed, and they will bring ruin to us all. But inside the Whitlock home, there was no curse, only the echo of violence, passed down like inheritance, binding each generation to the sins of the one before. Silas Whitlock had become a man of stone, cold, distant, and worn beyond his years. The toll of war, endless labor, and festering resentment had carved deep lines into his face. He ruled not as a father, but as a tyrant, wielding fear like scripture. In his world, outsiders were enemies, weakness meant death, and loyalty was law. There was no room for kindness, his faith was survival, and his children were molded to carry that creed. Thomas, the eldest, was nearly a grown man, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and already echoing his father's tone. He stalked the property at night with a shotgun in hand, daring anyone to cross their land. Neighbors whispered they heard him pacing along the fence line after midnight, a ghostly rhythm of vigilance that never ceased. James, quieter and more inward, bore his father's teachings differently. His drawings became darker with each passing season. Men sinking into swamps, faceless figures, barns engulfed in flame. He never spoke of what haunted him, only poured it into ink and paper. Once, Martha found his sketchbook hidden beneath the floorboards. On one page was the figure of a man hanging from a tree, faceless but unmistakably real. She shut the book trembling and spoke of it to no one. Mary and Ruth, the daughters, lived bound by silence. Mary grew sharp-edged, her gentleness stripped away. By 15, she had mastered the art of reading her father's moods, seeing the storm before it struck. Her silence could wound as deeply as words. Ruth, still young, watched and absorbed everything. Her eyes seemed always fixed on the darkness around her, as though she were memorizing it. Those who caught a glimpse of her swore they had never seen her smile. Martha stood in the center of it all, trapped, praying for a way out she no longer believed existed. Yet her prayers were not for herself, but for her children, that they might somehow escape the shadow closing in around their name. Her voice, once bright with hymns, had withered into whispers. At night, when the house fell silent, she begged heaven to free them from the curse of their father's will. Then came the summer of 1871, the season when blood once again tainted their land. Two travelers, war-worn men seeking work, were last seen near the Whitlock farm. They had no enemies in Drew County, no quarrels with anyone. Their only mistake was seeking shelter too close to the wrong property. By dawn, their campsite lay in ruins, bedrolls torn apart, belongings scattered, and no sign of life. Search parties scoured the land, but no bodies were found. What they did find, however, were horse tracks cutting deep into the mud, leading straight toward Whitlock soil. Silas denied everything, claiming ignorance, but the whispers spread fast. The Whitlocks were no longer simply feared. They were branded as predators. Soon after, farmers began losing livestock without explanation. A cow vanished overnight, a coop left in shambles, feathers scattered like snow. In another time, such losses might have been blamed on wolves or thieves, but in Drew County, every shadow pointed toward the Whitlocks. The sheriff made another attempt to investigate, but the law could find no ground to stand on. No bodies, no proof, only fear, and fear served the Whitlocks better than any defense ever could. When the investigation faded, 2 more men were gone, and the town was left with nothing but unanswered prayers. Inside the house, Silas grew more defiant. He told his children, "The world wants us gone, but we'll never bend." It was no longer a warning, it was doctrine. He was forging his family into weapons, testing their devotion through silence, binding them to secrecy so complete that even the idea of normal life became impossible. The youngest children absorbed his madness as truth. Ruth no longer cried. James's drawings grew even more disturbing. Mary mimicked her father's tone, sharp, cold, commanding. Thomas, restless and eager, carried his father's fury like inheritance. Even Martha had stopped believing in escape. It was not only fear of Silas that held her, it was the dread of what her children had already become. Leaving would mean abandoning them to the darkness entirely, so she stayed, praying in secret to a God she no longer felt could hear her. As the decade waned, the Whitlock's name turned from misfortune to menace. Travelers through Arkansas were warned to steer clear of Drew County. Saloons told their story in hushed tones. The farm became a legend, a wound on the land that refused to heal. To outsiders it was folklore. To the neighbors it was terrifyingly real. They saw faint glows flicker from the Whitlock house on swampy nights, heard footsteps pacing, and sometimes screams carried over the still water. By the end of the 1870s, the Whitlocks were no longer just feared, they were despised. But hatred festers in silence until it finds the courage to act. And it was that festering hatred, burning quietly through the dying years of Reconstruction, that would one day bring Drew County and the Whitlocks to a violent reckoning. By 1873, the county stood divided. Ordinary families lived their lives by daylight, while the Whitlocks ruled a world of shadow. Their name had become an omen, heavy and unshakable. Their sagging farmhouse loomed larger than any church or courthouse, a monument to dread. People spoke less of them directly, but their story hovered in every tale of loss or misfortune. And when resentment finally surfaced, it did not come from strangers or passing travelers. It rose from their very neighbors, the Carrows and the Bowmans. Families who had once kept their distance now found that silence could no longer protect them. Their livestock was vanishing too. The darkness that surrounded the Whitlocks had begun to reach outward. The children of Drew County had grown up afraid of the shadows that shifted in the woods, of distant gunshots echoing through the night. But fear over time began to turn into anger. The breaking point came with the disappearance of a single boy. Peter Bowman, just 12 years old, failed to return home one evening after fishing along the edges of the cypress swamp. His horse came back alone, reins dragging in the mud. For 2 days, search parties combed through the swamp, calling his name until their voices gave out. But Peter was gone. No tracks, no clues, no body. The only certainty came from the last rider who'd seen him alive. The boy had been headed toward the Whitlock boundary. For the Bowmans, grief curdled into fury. To them, there was no mystery and no curse, only the Whitlocks. They were sure the family had taken Peter just as they'd taken others before. At the next Sunday gathering, William Bowman stood before the congregation, his voice trembling with both rage and despair. He named the Whitlocks as murderers and swore he would not rest until his son's disappearance was avenged. The church erupted into whispers, some pleading for calm, others agreeing in grim silence. But the air had shifted. The county's fear had begun to rot into something darker. For years, people had whispered the same names: Elias Tully, Samuel Carter, the lost travelers, the missing livestock, and done nothing. But now a child was gone. The line between fear and shame was blurring. If they stayed silent any longer, their silence would make them complicit. Even those who had once urged caution began to admit what they'd long denied: the Whitlocks had to be stopped. News of Bowman's accusation traveled quickly to the Whitlock farm. Silas met it as he met all things, with cold indifference and denial. But to his eldest son, Thomas, the insult burned deep. He had grown into manhood under his father's shadow, molded by a creed of strength, suspicion, and defiance. To him, Bowman's words weren't just an accusation. They were an attack on the family's very survival. That evening, as the cicadas sang through the heavy Arkansas dusk, Thomas paced the porch with his rifle across his arms. Martha, sitting inside at the kitchen table, heard his voice through the screen door. "They think they can take us down," he muttered. "They think we'll bow." He paused, his tone sharpening into something fierce and raw. "No Whitlock bows." Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, holding back the prayer that wanted to escape. She had seen this pattern too many times before. Rumor, silence, accusation, and then blood. It was never peace that followed, only loss. She knew in her bones that once again it would be the county that blood, not her husband. In Drew County, tension thickened like storm clouds. Neighbors began to speak more openly, gathering in barns instead of whispering behind closed doors. Men carried lanterns, shut the doors tight, and spoke of justice, of defending their families, of ending the terror the sheriff dared not confront. Some counseled patience. Others, like William Bowman, spoke of vengeance. Yet even among hardened veterans there was unease. The Whitlocks were not just a family anymore. They were a legend steeped in dread. To move against them was to tempt something cursed. But fear had finally met its match in rage. On a rain-heavy night, when thunder rolled across the fields, a decision was made. They would ride to the Whitlock property, confront Silas, and demand answers. Whether those answers came in words or blood no longer mattered. Word of the plan reached the Whitlocks before the men could even gather. Ruth, the youngest, overheard the whispers during a market trip. Women talking too freely, assuming the child couldn't understand. When she told her mother, Martha's face went pale. She had seen this before. Nothing born of confrontation ever ended in truth. It ended in graves. When she told Silas, his reaction was as predictable as it was terrifying. He nodded once, stone-faced. "They fear us," he said. "And when men fear, they strike. Let them come." And so the Whitlocks prepared. Guns were cleaned, ammunition counted, boards reinforced. Thomas took command of nightly patrols, a dark figure pacing the fence line for all to see. The daughters stayed indoors, silent as ghosts. James filled page after page by candlelight, sketching twisted figures, as though capturing the storm before it broke. And Martha prayed, though even her prayers had grown brittle with despair, hollowed out by knowing that no mercy could stop what was coming. The clash was inevitable now. To the Whitlocks, it was a matter of survival, pride, and blood. To the county it was justice, vengeance, and deliverance. Between the two, there was no room left for peace. Years of silence, of whispered fear and unsolved vanishings had brought them all to this precipice. By the summer of 1873, Drew County could feel it, the weight of something final pressing down like heat. The earth cracked beneath a merciless sun, cicadas screamed endlessly in the heavy air, and every man knew the reckoning was near. Whispers had hardened into plans, plans had turned into resolve. Farmers, preachers, and old soldiers met in barns beneath the lantern light, men haunted by fear but driven by anger. And at the center of it all stood William Bowman, a father hollowed by loss, who refused to let his boy fade into silence like the rest. To him there was no curse, no mystery, no divine punishment. The Whitlocks were flesh and blood, and they would pay. The plan was simple, at least in words: ride out to the Whitlock farm under the cover of darkness, confront Silas, demand the truth. But in Drew County, nothing involving the Whitlocks ever ended with truth. It always ended with blood, and forced the truth from his mouth. They bore no name, carried no banners, and offered no speeches, only a shared purpose born of fear and fury. Fathers, brothers, and neighbors bound together not by righteousness, but by desperation. Inside the Whitlock home, the atmosphere turned sharp and heavy. Silas knew the moment would come. He had sensed the county's shift long before any whisper reached his door. To a man who saw endurance as his creed, this was no surprise. He did not fear it, he prepared for it. For days he readied his sons, rifles in hand, Thomas taking the lead with fierce resolve, James silent yet steadfast. The daughters, Mary and Ruth, were kept close, their wide eyes mirroring the growing tension. Martha, hands clasped in prayer, began to wonder whether this storm might finally break the endless chain of dread that strangled their family. That night came without moon or mercy. Thick clouds smothered the stars, and the world seemed swallowed by a darkness even the pines could not contain. Insects droned loudly through the thick Arkansas air until the sound of hooves cut through their hum. Down the dirt path shadows took form, men on horseback, their lanterns dim, rifles glinting faintly. 15 in all, faces set hard as stone. The Whitlocks were ready. From the porch Thomas watched, rifle gleaming in the lantern light. Silas stepped out beside him, tall, rigid, a man carved from defiance itself. Behind them, Martha and the children lingered in the doorway, witnesses to the moment their fate was sealed. The riders drew to a halt by the fence, horses snorting, breath fogging in the heavy air. Silence hung thick between both sides, the kind that feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. It was William Bowman who finally spoke, his voice trembling with rage and grief. "Silas Whitlock, you've got my boy's blood on your hands. You and your cursed brood have poisoned this county long enough. We're here for answers." The accusation cracked through the night like a whip. The men shifted uneasily, gripping their rifles tighter, the scent of whiskey and fear sharp in the air. Silas stepped forward, his tone calm but cutting. "Your boy wandered into the swamp. The swamp took him, not me. Don't you dare lay his death at my door." The words hit Bowman like a strike. He raised his rifle, hands shaking with fury.
"You lying bastard!"
Every man here knows the truth. For a heartbeat, silence again. A wire pulled tight, waiting to snap. Then Thomas's voice sliced through it, young but fierce. "Step on this land, and you'll never leave it." The challenge lit the air like a spark. Horses shifted. Men glanced at one another, torn between fear and pride. Then Bowman shouted, "So be it." The first gunshot broke the night wide open. No one would ever know who fired it, Whitlock defiance or Bowman's grief. But once the sound tore through the dark, there was no turning back. Chaos erupted. Rifles thundered. Lanterns swung wildly. Shadows collided in a blur of fire and screams. The Whitlocks fired from the porch, each shot measured and furious. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering wood and striking flesh. The riders returned fire blindly, their horses bucking in terror. Men shouted, stumbled, fell. Thomas fought like a man possessed. His eyes burning, his hands relentless on the trigger. James fired from the window with eerie calm, every shot deliberate. Mary and Ruth huddled behind them, silent as ghosts. Martha held her youngest close, her body trembling, her prayers long since turned to tears. She knew this ending. The pattern had never changed. Silence, rumor, accusation, and finally blood. The fight was brief, but its echoes stretched eternal. When the gunfire faded and the smoke thinned, the riders were broken. some dead, others limping back into the dark. The Whitlocks remained standing. Silas was unscathed. Thomas still gripped his rifle. James's eyes were steady. Their survival was not victory, it was proof. Proof that they were beyond reach, above law or consequence. But for Drew County, the cost was unbearable. The night had promised justice and delivered only graves. Wives wept, mothers screamed, and the name Whitlock became a curse sharper than ever. That night, in the silence that followed, Martha sat on the blood-stained porch, shaking as dawn crept in. She stared at the drying crimson beneath her feet, listening to her son's heavy breaths. Her prayers had withered, her faith hollow. She realized then what she had long refused to see, that God had abandoned the Whitlock house long ago. The clan, bound by pride and survival, had spilled open war onto the soil of Drew County. What had begun as whispers was now blood. And though the night ended, everyone knew the truth. This was only the beginning. Along the road, smoke lingered stubbornly in the air. Birds avoided the trees they once filled, as though nature itself recoiled from what it had witnessed. Horses roamed loose. Wagons lay deserted, and men rested beneath hastily spread blankets in barns, their blood soaking into hay and timber. Of those who had ridden out the night before, only a few made it home. Families gathered in mourning, not only for their dead, but for their failure. They had tried to end the Whitlocks, yet the clan remained, unbroken and darker than ever. It wasn't just defeat, it was disgrace. William Bowman buried his son Peter without a body to lower into the soil, then laid to rest a brother killed in the firefight. His grief hardened into something cold and immovable. The rage that once filled his voice in public now settled into whispers, promises of vengeance forged in quiet fury. Across Drew County, that same bitterness spread. Some claimed the Whitlocks truly were protected, not by law or skill, but by something darker. Others cursed themselves for ever trying to challenge them. A few men simply left, unable to live beneath the weight of failure, but even distance couldn't erase the memory. Stories spread quickly across Arkansas. The tale of Drew County, neighbors rising against a cursed family and falling beneath their guns, rippled through towns for miles. Each retelling painted the Whitlocks as something less human, more legend. Dangerous farmers became monstrous phantoms, and with every whisper their shadow grew. Few cared for truth anymore. Fear was the story that stuck, and the Whitlocks thrived on it. Inside the Whitlock home, their survival was treated not as chance, but as destiny. Silas saw the battle as proof of everything he had ever preached. That the world outside wanted them dead, and only blood loyalty could keep them alive. He thundered his own kind of sermons, lessons about strength, pride, and mistrust. The raid had not been tragedy, he told them. It was proof of envy and weakness in others. The Whitlocks had endured, and so they would continue to endure. Thomas carried those words like armor. He walked the farm with a swagger sharpened by victory, as though even the shadows bowed before him. Neighbors who spotted him riding alone said defiance gleamed clear in his eyes, daring anyone to challenge him. To Thomas, that night had not been horror. It was a test, and he had passed it. The Whitlocks bowed to no one. James, the quieter brother, carried the memory differently. His sketches turned grim, pages filled with fire, smoke, and men collapsing beneath trees. The gentle drawings of barns and animals were gone, replaced by rifles, graves, and faces of his family rendered broader, darker, eternal. The sisters withdrew further into silence. Mary grew sharp, her tone clipped and cold whenever she spoke. Ruth, the youngest, no longer seemed a child. While other girls her age played with dolls, she only watched. Patient, still, her eyes unsettling in their calm. Martha bore the weight most deeply. Though her family's bodies survived, her soul did not. She prayed through sleepless nights, her whispered pleas vanishing into emptiness. Each shot from that night echoed endlessly in her mind. She saw every dead man not as an enemy, but as a sign of damnation. Once she believed her family was cursed. Now she understood the truth. They were the curse. Across the county, fear changed shape. It grew quieter, crueler, buried deep beneath daily life. Men eyed their rifles and wondered why their bullets had failed while Whitlock bullets found every mark. Mothers pulled their children close when passing the Whitlock fence, as if shadows might reach out from behind the posts. Candles burned late into the night as families whispered tales they once tried to forget. Then, the vanishings began again. That autumn, a hunter named Josiah Clark disappeared into the woods. His dogs came back alone, bleeding, trembling. Men searched for days, but found nothing. Most knew what they believed the Whitlocks had taken him. None dared say it aloud, not after what had happened last time. Months later, wagon tracks were found near the swamp, leading nowhere. Locals swore a traveling family from Louisiana vanished on that same route. All that was discovered was a child's toy, half buried in mud. Suspicion turned once more to the Whitlock farm, but no one had the courage to confront them. The pattern was set. For the Whitlocks, silence meant safety. For the county, silence meant captivity. Terror had taken root deep and permanent, woven into the soil itself. The years passed, the 1870s grinding onward, and with every season came new whispers. The Whitlocks still farmed their land as if untouched, because in truth, nothing had changed. The law of blood ruled stronger than ever. The Whitlocks killed, or were accused of killing. They survived, they endured. The county mourned and stayed silent. Year after year, Drew County's grief hardened into legend. Deaths without confession, pain without healing, whispers without end. Yet legends, no matter how dark, never silence men forever. The county still held fathers who had buried sons, and mothers who wept for vanished kin. By 1875, 8 years since Elias Tully's blood had stained the Whitlock fence, voices began to rise again, faint but growing. The Whitlocks had silenced Drew County once, but blood never forgets. Hatred festers, and when it returns, it cuts deeper than before. Martha felt it before the rest. Each night, when the wind moaned through the pines or dogs barked at unseen shapes, she shuddered, knowing retribution was drawing near. Silas dismissed her fears as weakness. Thomas laughed at the thought that anyone would dare come again. But Martha knew better. She knew deep inside that survivors never truly escape. They only endure, and for the Whitlock family, that endurance was far from finished. By 1876, Drew County existed in two worlds. One lived under the blazing Arkansas sun, where crops still grew and daily life carried on. The other hid beneath the haunting shadow of the Whitlocks, where fear rooted itself deeper with every passing year. The community was split, torn between those desperate for justice and those who believed silence was the only way to stay alive. The disastrous raid of 1873 had left its mark. Graves still bore the memory of that failure. Widows sat in church pews, glaring across at the families who had pushed them into tragedy. Many fathers fled the land entirely, unwilling to raise children beside Whitlock soil. The defeat had frightened some into quiet submission, but for others, grief turned into grim resolve. No one embodied that resolve more than William Bowman. With his son Peter's death unsolved and his brother newly buried, his pain hardened into purpose. He no longer shouted his fury from pulpits. Instead, he worked in silence, spreading whispers of vengeance with the same precision that Silas Whitlock used to spread fear in his household. Bowman's voice was calm now, convincing, deliberate, and dangerous. He told fathers their children would never sleep safely while a Whitlock still breathed. He warned farmers their livestock and land would wither under the curse as long as Whitlock rifles remained loaded. People listened. Not all, but enough. The county's balance shifted again, slow and steady, like a storm brewing beyond the fields. Meanwhile, life at the Whitlock farm decayed in strange stillness. They worked their land as always, though the soil grew barren and the fences sagged into ruin. The house itself seemed caught in a pocket of time, the air heavy with rot and memory. Silas aged visibly, his body weakening even as his rule hardened. His words carried more iron than ever, even when his voice cracked with sickness. To him, illness was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. Thomas, now grown and broad-shouldered, filled the space his father's frailty left behind. Fearless and brutal, he stalked the property like a king, daring any man to challenge him. His name spread wider than Silas's ever had. People spoke it in whispers, calling him not just Silas's son, but the living heir to the family's darkness. James was different. Though grown, his silence had deepened into something unreachable. He spoke only to Martha, who clung to the last thread of gentleness within him. His sketches had evolved into chilling works of art, haunting, detailed drawings of faceless figures burning, men swallowed by swamps, rifles flashing in endless night. Rumors spread that he filled entire books with those images. Some swore that if you saw James by lantern light, his eyes looked like he'd witnessed horrors not yet born. Mary had become sharper, harder, her words cutting like her father's. She wielded silence the way others wielded knives. And Ruth, the youngest, was no child anymore. Her wide, hollow eyes carried a quiet expectation, as if she knew something terrible was nearing. In town, tensions thickened. Some citizens called for law, demanding the sheriff act. But Sheriff Briggs, older now, worn and weary, wanted no part of another bloodbath. He reminded them what the failed raid had already proven: challenging the Whitlocks meant death. Without proof, the law had no weapon sharp enough to pierce their curse. So men turned once again to themselves. Bowman's whispers grew into plans, not drunken rage this time, but careful preparation. Count rifles, measure courage, wait for the right moment. If the Whitlocks were to fall, it would be through sheer, unstoppable force. Meanwhile, Drew County sank deeper into fear. People vanished. Travelers lost, hunters gone missing. Some blamed the Whitlocks outright. Others didn't dare say it aloud, but all believed it in their hearts. Truth no longer mattered. Perception alone was enough. The Whitlocks had become the county's curse, the explanation for every misfortune, every death. Martha felt it too. She sensed vengeance closing in on them, creeping closer with each sunset. At night, when cicadas screamed and the swamp wind rattled the shutters, she would wait for the sound of hooves, for lanterns flickering through the trees. Silas dismissed her fears. Thomas laughed at them. But Martha knew the truth. The reckoning hadn't died in 1873. It had only been delayed, and she feared what her children had turned into by the time it finally returned. Then, one evening, a visitor arrived, the first in months. A young preacher named Matthew Collins, newly assigned to the county, rode to the Whitlock farm despite every warning. He said he only wished to pray with them, to remind them that no soul was beyond redemption. He was never seen again. Days later, his horse was found wandering alone. His Bible turned up near the swamp, its pages torn and soaked with mud. To Drew County, this wasn't coincidence. It was divine judgment. God's own messenger had been swallowed by the darkness that lingered at the Whitlock place. And that meant one thing: the Whitlocks had crossed the final line. After Reverend Collins vanished, silence broke apart completely. No more whispers, no more hesitation. Church sermons roared about evil walking among them, and for the first time, the Whitlock name was shouted from the pulpit. Bowman moved swiftly, his cause now sanctified, not revenge but redemption for Drew County. By the end of 1876, vigilante groups formed openly. No secrecy, no hiding in barns. They sharpened rifles in broad daylight and rode beneath the open sun, declaring their intent for all to hear. The county was no longer divided. The sides were clear. War was coming not as rumor, but as destiny, and inside their decaying home, the Whitlocks waited, in silence and in blood. By 1877, Drew County no longer questioned their guilt. It had already made its choice. That question had long since been buried. Every vanished child, every hunter who never returned, every wagon found deserted in the swamp became another nail sealing the coffin of silence. Fathers no longer debated what must be done. They already knew. Mothers pleaded for restraint, but grief speaks louder than reason. The decision was made. The Whitlocks would meet their reckoning. This would not be a secret raid under cover of darkness. This time it would be war. The word spread quietly, carried in murmurs over fence lines and whispered prayers in church pews. Families made solemn promises to one another, to ride when the moment came. Men sharpened blades, cleaned rifles, and filled bottles with kerosene. The goal was not confrontation, it was eradication, fire, gunshot, and finality. To most, it was less about justice than purification, a cleansing of a name that had poisoned Drew County for nearly a decade. They convinced themselves it was God's will, their duty as righteous men. But beneath the sermons and speeches, it was vengeance disguised as virtue, driven by years of fear and loss. Inside the Whitlock home, the air hung heavy, charged with unspoken dread, as if even the walls understood what waited beyond the horizon. Silas, now an old man with sickness clawing at his lungs, had grown frail in body but not in will. His cold, unyielding eyes burned with the same defiance that had ruled the family for decades. To him, this was not defeat approaching. It was his final battle. "Let them come," he rasped. "We finish it here." Thomas, the family's strength and soldier, moved like a man preparing for glory. He oiled his rifle, patrolled the edge of the fields, and faced the darkness with a grim smile. Death did not frighten him. It was the legacy he longed to claim. James stood apart, withdrawn into a silence more profound than ever. His drawings had grown macabre and precise, pages filled with burning houses, faceless men, and the Whitlock home consumed by fire. Silas ignored them, but Martha saw. She could not tell if they were prophecy or nightmare, but in James's quiet, she sensed he already knew how it would end. Mary had hardened completely, her voice cutting sharp as her father's, her stare hollow and resolute. Ruth, though still young, had shed the last trace of innocence. She followed Mary like a shadow, her silence colder than the storm to come. And Martha, once the heart of the home, was little more than a spirit clinging to frayed faith. Each night she prayed not for victory, but for deliverance, from blood, from silence, from the curse that had devoured her family. The siege began on a night heavy with thunder. Storm clouds choked the sky, smothering the moon in blackness. Out of that darkness came more than 24 men, their boots sinking into wet earth, rifles and torches in hand. Lanterns swung like omens as they surrounded the crooked Whitlock house. Only one voice broke the roar of wind and rain, William Bowman's. His tone was not wild with rage, but solemn, carved by grief too deep for shouting. "Silas Whitlock," he called, "enough blood has been spilled. Come out and face what you've brought upon this land." Inside, silence held them all. Even Silas paused, the sickness rattling in his chest. Then, slowly, the old man stood. He coughed into his sleeve, steadied himself, and stepped to the doorway. His eyes burned against the torchlight, his voice cracked but unbroken. "You want the Whitlocks," he said. "Then come and take us." The first torch hit the porch, flames racing along the kerosene-soaked boards. Gunfire cracked through the storm, and chaos erupted. The Whitlocks fought like trapped beasts. Thomas roared through every window, rifle flashing, shouting curses into the dark. James fired with chilling calm, his aim deadly precise, as if each shot fulfilled the drawings he'd made. Mary reloaded beside them, her face ghostly in the flickering firelight. Even Ruth, silent and pale, carried powder and cartridges to her brothers, her small hands steady in the madness. Martha sat clutching her Bible, praying as the fire grew and the air turned black with smoke. For all her years of fearing this moment, she understood it was inevitable. This was the only end the Whitlocks could ever have. Outside, the attackers pressed harder, shouting over the storm, firing into the blaze. The house, old and dry from years of decay, caught fast. Flames climbed the walls, swallowing the roof beams as boards screamed under the heat. Still, the Whitlocks fought on. Each bullet they fired dropped another man, but their doom crept closer with every second. The fire became unbearable. Smoke choked the halls, bullets tore through the flaming walls, and the porch collapsed in a rain of sparks. Silas staggered forward through the haze, rifle trembling in his hands. He coughed, aimed into the firelit night, and pulled the trigger one last time before the flames consumed him. His body fell backward into the inferno that had carried his name too long. The others followed soon after. Thomas went down fighting. James vanished into the smoke. Mary's voice was swallowed by the roar, and Ruth disappeared in silence. Martha's prayers ended in a whisper. By dawn, the Whitlocks were gone. When the storm cleared, only ash and embers remained. The county called it victory, but the air held no joy, no peace, only emptiness. Dozens were dead, Whitlocks and townsmen alike, blood mixing in the mud. The family's name had been erased, but its shadow had not. The Whitlocks died that night not only as a family destroyed, but as a legend born in fire, one that Drew County would never escape. Travelers passing through Drew County heard the tale often, the cursed family consumed by fire, and the men who rode out to destroy them. Parents warned their children never to wander near the swamp, where the ghosts of the Whitlocks were said to drift through the smoke. Yet some whispered that not all of them perished that night, that 1 or 2 children had escaped into the darkness, surviving the flames to carry their blood into the world beyond. In the ashes of that ruined home, truth no longer mattered. Legend had taken its place, darker and more enduring than any fact could ever be. When the fire at last burned out, nothing remained of the Whitlock farm but blackened beams and thin smoke curling into the pale Arkansas sky. The soil itself seemed wounded, scorched and raw, as if unable to forget. County men stood among the ruins, rifles still hot, throats ragged from shouting. They had won, or so they told themselves. The Whitlocks were gone, their home, their silence, their hold on Drew County, all erased by flame. Yet when dawn came, when the smoke cleared and sunlight spilled across the charred remains, an unease settled over them. Bodies were dragged from the rubble, burned beyond recognition, twisted together by fire. Silas Whitlock lay near the hearth. Thomas was found clutching his rifle so tightly that it had to be pried from his hands. Mary and Ruth were discovered together in the kitchen, their forms fused by heat. James lay silent at last beside his sketchbook, now nothing but cinders, and Martha was found near the threshold, one arm stretched outward, as though still reaching for the world beyond. For Bowman and his men, it should have been the end, closure after years of fear. But what stared back from that smouldering ruin was not peace. It was horror. Horror at what they had done to end the Whitlocks. Horror at what they themselves had become. The sight of burned children, of neighbors reduced to ash, stripped away any illusion of righteousness. They called it justice, but every man there knew the truth. The price had been far too great. The county buried its dead. The men lost in the siege and the Whitlocks alike, placed in unmarked graves at the edge of their blackened land. Some said the ground refused to take them, that it was too cursed for consecrated soil. Others believed the earth had swallowed them whole, poisoned by the blood it absorbed. Yet the story did not die with the smoke. In the years that followed, the Whitlock name clung to Drew County like a scar. Travelers were warned to keep to the main roads. Children were told to behave, lest the Whitlocks come for them. Locals swore that at night you could still hear Thomas's footsteps patrolling the ruins, or see the faint outline of a girl, Ruth, perhaps, staring silently from the trees. The truth could never be buried. It lingered in whispers, in superstition, in the air itself. The Whitlocks had never been just a family. They had become a reflection of fear, vengeance, and the darkness that lives quietly inside men. The fire may have destroyed their bodies, but it only gave life to their myth. Their story spread from town to town, reshaped and retold. Part history, part warning, part nightmare. By 1880, Drew County had quieted. Crops returned, homes were rebuilt, wagons once again rolled down the dirt roads. But the land where the Whitlock house once stood remained untouched. Farmers refused to claim it, no matter the price. The soil was said to be dead, barren and black, cursed by what had burned there. Trees grew twisted, grass came in patches, and the silence was heavier than anywhere else in the county. Those who passed by claimed they felt eyes on them, an unseen presence watching from the ruins. Horses quickened their pace, men averted their gaze. No one lingered. Still, the rumors persisted. Some said the wind carried Silas's voice, whispering the old creed, a man protects his own. Others claimed James's sketchbooks had survived, hidden in barns or attics, filled with drawings that foretold the fire. No one admitted to owning them, but everyone swore they existed. The darkest tale of all was that one Whitlock had escaped, a child who slipped through smoke and shadow to vanish into the woods. No one could agree whether it was a son or daughter, but the idea alone was enough to keep the legend alive. Because in the end, the truth mattered less than belief, and belief cuts deeper than fact. The Whitlock story did not end in 1877. It lived on, in courthouse records written in fading ink, in Bible margins scrawled by trembling hands, in taverns where old men muttered of the cursed clan consumed by their own fire. Children grew up hearing tales told under blankets, of footsteps in the dark and faces glimpsed in the woods. The Whitlock bloodline was gone, their house reduced to ash, but their story refused the grave. Drew County moved on, healed perhaps, but never forgot. The name Whitlock became a warning, a weight, a ghost that reminded every generation what silence and vengeance could breed. To some, they were cursed. To others, evil. But for those who looked deeper, the truth was far worse. The Whitlocks needed no curse. They were flesh and blood, pride and pain, cruelty and fear. They were human. And that was what made their story so terrifying. And long after the fire cooled, when the last Whitlock was only a whisper in the dark, one question still lingered. Were they born monsters, or were they made by the land that raised them, by neighbors who watched in silence until the flames were all that remained? No answer ever came, only echoes. Every family hides its secrets, some so dark they should never see the light. Here we uncover those forgotten sins, the hidden crimes and silent pacts buried beneath history's soil. If you've stayed with us this long, it means you carry that same forbidden curiosity. So don't look away, subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us for the next revelation. Because every day, new shadows rise, and only those who dare to face them will hear their stories.